Dits publicly praised for their transparency had not been completed for 2 consecutive cycles, and no one had said a word. The office responsible for compliance issued a brief statement, unexpected delays due to restructuring. But behind closed doors, files had been pulled, auditors reassigned, questions shut down, and then someone simply disappeared. Michael Hargrove, the palace's external accountant for over 20 years, had been cooperating with Anne unofficially. But 2 weeks after their last conversation, he was gone. No resignation, no forwarding contact. His office cleared out overnight. When Anne inquired, the response was ice cold. "We have no comment on former contractors." Something far more sinister had its grip on the Crown's coffers. Through a confidential channel, Anne requested access to a dormant MI5 file tied to suspicious international financial activity involving British royals during the 1990s. The response arrived in a sealed envelope, no digital trace. The file was marked classified. Underneath it, in handwritten red ink, sealed until 2118. 100 years. Whatever truths lay inside had been buried under the full weight of the British state. Anne was not easily shaken, but a single conversation chilled her to the bone. It was with her mother's former financial advisor, a man long since retired, rarely seen in public. When Anne pressed him, he gave her a long look, a look that held too many secrets. Then he simply said, "Don't dig further, Anne. Some stones are buried for a reason." But for Anne, walking away wasn't an option, because what she found next was a name she never expected. It wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet anymore, it was family. The deeper Anne dug, the more one name kept surfacing in the financial shadows. A name that would shatter her world, Prince Andrew. Could her own brother be the orchestrator of a global-scale fraud? For days, Anne battled with herself. She needed to believe there was another explainer. Tion, a clerical mistake, a misattribution. But the data was merciless. The deeper she went, the more damning the connections became. Royal funds routed through anonymous firms in the Caribbean. Shell corporations created and dissolved within months. When she cross-referenced those companies' directors, a pattern emerged: names that once appeared in news headlines standing beside her brother during diplomatic trips. Men and women tied to arms deals, property empires, and off-the-books ventures in Eastern Europe. Some were now under investigation. Others had vanished entirely. But what pierced Anne the most wasn't just the names or the numbers, it was the dates. Key transactions aligned almost perfectly with Andrew's international engagements, often those categorized as private business. A 3-day trip to Kazakhstan followed by a £74 million withdrawal. A supposed conference in Singapore that coincided with the opening of a holding company. And then came the unexplained visit to Dubai. A trip Anne herself hadn't been informed about, even though it appeared to involve royal interests. She confronted the palace scheduling office, only to be told there were no records, no staff logs, no flight manifests under his name. It was as though the entire visit had been erased. But one thing hadn't been deleted: a wire transfer dated the same week, bearing a vague description: strategic advisory fees. Desperate for clarity, Anne accessed a restricted archive of internal communications messages between senior royals and their advisors. Most were routine. But then she found something that made her stomach turn. Email threads marked delete upon reading. One, in particular, referenced a trust fund movement with the subject line as discussed keep off record. The sender's address had long been deactivated, but the recipient was unmistakable. A senior staffer directly attached to Andrew's overseas ventures. The royal facade was cracking, and at its center stood her own blood. Anne. Resolve hardened. She waited until the family was gathered at Balmoral, using the cover of an evening walk to confront Andrew privately. There were no aides, no walls to hide behind, just the two of them and the truth. When she mentioned the companies, the discrepancies, the deleted files, Andrew didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he smiled a cold, lifeless curve of the lips and said something that would haunt her forever. "You don't want to end up like Diana." It was no longer a question of misdeeds. It was a warning, a threat, an admission wrapped in menace. In that moment, Anne understood she was no longer dealing with personal betrayal. She was up against something designed to protect itself at any cost. Shaken but not silenced, Anne knew this wasn't just a family scandal, it was a royal crime scene. And the palace? It was about to turn on her. The monarchy has survived centuries by mastering one art: silence. When Anne started asking too many questions, the palace machinery kicked into overdrive. Doors closed, phones went dead. And for the first time in her life, Anne felt hunted inside her own home. It began quietly, subtly. One by one, Anne's trusted aides, some who had worked beside her for over a decade, were reassigned with no warning, no farewell, just gone, replaced by newer, younger faces with no connection to her past, no loyalty to her mission. When she asked for clarification, her inquiries were met with vague explanations about modernization efforts and routine rotation. But Anne wasn't naive. These weren't coincidences, they were calculated isolations. The inner circle around her was being dismantled piece by piece. She was being left in the open. Worse still was the realization that her private movements were no longer private. She requested archived surveillance footage from her office wing to confirm a suspicious late-night file breach. The footage didn't exist, not corrupted, not damaged, simply gone. Entire days had been wiped from the system, replaced with blank timestamps. The security team, usually quick to assist, suddenly couldn't answer the simplest questions. When pressed, one official let something slip. We were told not to intervene. By whom? He wouldn't say. He couldn't. And then came the meeting. A quiet summons from King Charles himself. No schedule, no press brief. Just Anne and her brother behind closed doors in a room where no devices were allowed. The atmosphere was stifling. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His message was clear. There are lines that even she, the most respected royal of the modern age, was not meant to cross. When she mentioned the financial records, the irregularities, and the danger of ignoring them, Charles said nothing for a long time. Then, with uncharacteristic coldness, he simply asked, "What do you think the country would do if it knew what we know?" The silence that followed was louder than any command. From that day forward, Anne felt the pressure. Chiton. She noticed the same dark sedan in her rearview mirror, whether in London or Windsor. It never followed too closely, never broke the law, but it never let her out of sight. One night it idled outside her estate until dawn. She reported it, but the number plates were fake. Her calls to trusted political allies went unanswered. Those who once hinted at help began distancing themselves. And then, inexplicably, the whistleblowers began to fold. A former royal accountant who had previously confirmed inconsistencies retracted his entire statement, claiming confusion and misremembered data. Another informant fled the country within 48 hours of agreeing to meet Anne. Something or someone was silencing them. Finally, Buckingham Palace broke its public silence. In a crisp, heavily worded press release, the institution firmly denied rumors of impropriety and reaffirmed its commitment to fiscal transparency and royal integrity. It was a warning disguised as reassurance. A message not for the public, but for her. But by then, it was too late for them. Because Anne had already foreseen this retaliation. She'd made digital copies, stored files across multiple secure channels, and perhaps most critically, she had built quiet alliances beyond the palace walls. But what the firm didn't anticipate was that Anne had already made copies, and she wasn't alone anymore. As the palace shut her out, others stepped in. A covert group of former royal staffers, intelligence whistleblowers, and political insiders had been watching the cracks in the monarchy for years. They'd been waiting for someone like Anne. Now the rebellion had a leader. In the silence that followed Buckingham's denials, Anne found herself approached not by journalists or opportunists, but by ghosts, names long erased from palace directories, voices that once whispered in hallways now speaking again, though from the shadows. It began with a series of cryptic messages, dropped in coded emails and disguise. D-packages. One envelope, slipped into her car during a charity visit, contained only a location and time. No explanation, no signature. She went, and waiting for her was a burner phone with a single message: "We believe you." It was the first time in weeks she'd felt seen. The next step came from an unexpected ally, a former GCHQ analyst known only by the codename Foxglove. They had tracked digital movements tied to royal accounts for years, watching as large transfers, thinly veiled as grants or development aid, were funneled into anonymous trusts. Foxglove had proof. They also had access. With their help, Anne uncovered a network of digital vaults stretching across the Commonwealth. New Zealand, Kenya, Canada, Ghana. Money that was meant for hospitals and infrastructure had quietly been redirected into joint ventures where royal proxies held controlling shares. Behind the illusion of goodwill, a silent empire had flourished, and no one had ever dared to question it. Anne began eating with members of this growing alliance in off-grid safehouses, abandoned estates and disused embassies far from the reach of palace surveillance. Each meeting brought new revelations, new allies. A former royal press officer, a disillusioned member of the Privy Council, a disgraced economist who had once audited royal-led development programs. Together, they created a living archive, one that couldn't be deleted, couldn't be buried. They called it Operation Regal Truth, a decentralized, encrypted library that held every document, every confession, every line of the monarchy's hidden ledgers. Through their efforts, Anne was handed a cache of classified documents from a former diplomat stationed in Lagos. The contents were damning blueprints of infrastructure projects, laced with bribes, falsified contracts, and evidence of offshore payouts to entities bearing strikingly royal names. The more she read, the more sickened she became. This wasn't just a mistake, it was systemic. And he deeper the roots of fraud stretched, the more powerful the branches it fed became. But with every file uncovered, Anne realized the scale was even bigger than she feared, and the target on her back was growing. Just as Anne prepared to go public, everything changed. A brake failure, a tunnel, a flash of headlights. It was no accident, and she knew it. They were trying to silence her. But what they didn't know was who had saved her. The morning had started like any other, calm, calculated. Anne was scheduled to meet with a veteran investigative journalist known for dismantling political dynasties. They had agreed on a neutral location, a countryside manor where cell signals were unreliable, perfect for privacy. She left alone, against protocol, with documents stored on an encrypted drive concealed in the lining of her coat. The drive contained everything: names, accounts, recordings, documents too volatile for palace walls. She was ready to risk it all. But less than 15 minutes from the meeting point, her world swerved literally. The brakes on her private vehicle failed without warning. On a narrow road leading into a tunnel, her car veered, accelerating. The wheel locked. No control, no exit, just the looming darkness ahead. What followed was chaos. Her vehicle spun. Headlights blinded her from behind. But in the instant before impact, a motorbike cut across her path. Not an attacker, an interceptor. The rider clipped her front bumper, sending the car skidding sideways, just enough to crash against the tunnel wall instead of slamming into the oncoming van that had suddenly appeared in the opposite lane. The airbags deployed. Anne blacked out. She awoke to an unfamiliar ceiling, a hospital. But the room was silent. Her name was missing from the patient registry. There were no visiting hours, no press leaks, no family, only silence. The staff refused to answer questions. Security stood guard at every corner. When Anne asked for the name of the facility, the nurse smiled nervously and changed the subject. It became clear the lockdown had been ordered from above. She wasn't being protected, she was being contained. But they hadn't stopped everything. A slip of paper was left on her nightstand while she slept. No envelope, no signature. Just 6 handwritten words: "Next time, we won't miss." It was a message, cruel in its simplicity. They hadn't just wanted to scare her, they'd wanted her gone. Had it not been for the motorcyclist, she would have been... 2 days later, Anne discharged herself against advice, against resistance. Her face was bruised, her hand fractured, but her resolve, unbreakable. She left the hospital bandaged and burning. The fury she once kept under royal restraint had transformed into something else: purpose. They had tried to eliminate her not just from the public eye, but from existence. And that was their mistake, because now she knew exactly how far they were willing to go, which meant she also knew how close she was to the truth. That was the last time Anne played defense. Now it was her turn to strike. The nation watched in disbelief as Princess Anne stepped into the press room not as a royal, but as a whistleblower. Cameras flashed. Reporters gasped. What she revealed next would forever change the way the world saw the crown. The broadcast lasted just under 14 minutes. But in that time, Anne detonated the monarchy's carefully constructed myth with precision and fury. Her voice was steady, but her words hit like thunder. She named names high-ranking members of the royal household, some still in power, some long believed untouchable. She accused them not of errors, but of intentional deceit, financial conspiracy, and betrayal of public trust on a scale no one had dared to imagine. Her tone wasn't vengeful, it was resolute. She didn't flinch. Not when she exposed the missing billions. Not when she implicated her own brother. Not even when she called into question the institution she had dedicated her life to defending. On screen, she presented the digital evidence. Redacted files made public in real time. Time-stamped transfers. Forged signatures. Internal memos marked classified eyes only. The web was intricate, global, and deliberate. Countries across the Commonwealth were caught in the net. Aid diverted, public funds misused, bribes routed through royal intermediaries posing as philanthropic envoys. Anne didn't just present documents, she presented the truth, ugly and unpolished. Her closing words echoed through every newsroom, "This is not treason. Silence is." The fallout was immediate. Within hours, international media flooded the story across front pages. Former royal staffers came forward, some in fear, some in solidarity. Protesters gathered outside palaces and embassies worldwide, demanding accountability. A wave of calls for investigation swept through Parliament, pushed by voices that had previously kept their distance. Commonwealth leaders demanded transparency, questioning what they had unknowingly been complicit in. In an unprecedented act of political urgency, the Prime Minister requested an emergency audience with King Charles that very night. Behind the walls of Buckingham, what was once whispered in corners now exploded into full-blown crisis. And then came the images, quiet but loud, in their symbolism. Across Australia, Canada, Barbados, and New Zealand, Queen Elizabeth's portrait was quietly removed from government buildings. Some were replaced by local figures. Others left the space blank, a symbolic void, representing the loss of blind faith. Anne had cracked the foundation, but she wasn't interested in applause or redemption. Her expression as she exited the press room wasn't one of triumph. It was grief. The price of truth was heavy. She had carried it alone for too long. Now the world would carry it too. But even as the storm raged and the world struggled to process what it had just heard, Anne knew this wasn't the end. Not yet, because the biggest revelation had been saved for last. Buried in a vault beneath Kensington Palace was the final piece of the puzzle, a handwritten ledger Anne's father had hidden before his death. Inside were the names, the accounts, and the dates, and one signature shocked her to the core. The archive was unearthed by chance or fate. E, a retired steward, dying of cancer, left Anne a single envelope in his will. It contained a map of the old royal storage vaults and a faded authorization card bearing Prince Philip's initials. Deep beneath the palace, sealed in a lead-lined box marked "Only Windsor Protocol," Anne found it. Not just ledgers, but something more intimate: journals, receipts, cassette tapes, and a single reel of 16mm film. And at the heart of it, a worn, leather-bound book that felt heavier than its size, a ledger, handwritten in Philip's unmistakable script. This was no financial diary. It was a blueprint, a playbook, a reckoning. Page after page revealed connections spanning continents. Leaders of oil-rich nations, CEOs of defense contractors, royal aides still employed by the firm. Each name meticulously documented alongside secret account numbers and coded initials. Some of these accounts had been dormant for decades. Others were still active. But what stunned Anne most was the section labelled Cont. Ingency Crown Sovereign Allocations. It detailed massive unauthorized payments greenlit during the Falklands War, money funneled through back channels, under the guise of emergency discretion. The sums were staggering. Anne stared in disbelief as she traced a single transaction: £132 million signed off during a month her mother had reportedly been in seclusion. But the signature at the bottom wasn't her father's. It was Elizabeth's. Anne's hands trembled. For the first time, she saw not just the shadow cast over the crown, but the shadows cast by those who wore it. Her mother, her father, the architects of a hidden kingdom built not just on public duty, but on secret leverage. And buried within the documents was a final envelope, marked simply for Anne. When you know, inside a recorded cassette. Philip's voice, firm, deliberate, spoke only once. You'll know when it's time. And you'll know what to do. The truth shattered everything. The missing billions weren't stolen. They were stockpiled, diverted into what the ledger described as a sovereign war fund, a private reserve assembled over decades, independent of government oversight, for scenarios deemed existential to the crown. In their eyes, this wasn't theft, it was survival. But at what cost? Anne wept as she read the last pages, not for herself, but for the people, for the decades of trust silently betrayed, for the billions moved in secrecy while citizens were told the monarchy served with dignity. The royal family had always preached sacrifice. But behind the velvet curtain, it had safeguarded itself above all. Anne had solved the mystery, but it came with a cost. Because now, she had to decide, truth or the crown. The palace gates remained closed, public trust crumbled. And Anne? She walked away from titles, from duty, from the weight of secrets. But her legacy would echo louder than any coronation. Because she didn't just expose the truth. She redefined what it meant to be royal. In the weeks that followed her public revelation, Anne moved with quiet certainty. She didn't hold press conferences. She didn't seek applause. She simply began dismantling the life that had once defined her. One by one, she relinquished ceremonial roles she'd held for decades, military patronages, diplomatic responsibilities, even her position within the Privy Council. There was no announcement, no farewell tour, just silence, a silence that spoke volumes. For Anne, this was not exile, it was liberation. She had carried the burden of a crown's conscience longer than anyone had known, and now she was finally laying it down. But before she left the public eye, she said goodbye to those who mattered most. In a quiet moment far from the cameras, Anne sat with her grandchildren beneath an ancient oak tree on the royal estate. She didn't speak of scandal or legacy. She simply looked into their young, unblinking eyes and said, never lie to the people, no matter the cost. It was more than advice. It was a vow passed down, no longer bound to a throne, but to truth itself. Meanwhile, Parliament moved swiftly. The tidal wave of public pressure could no longer be ignored. A formal investigation into royal finances was launched, dragging long-shielded documents into the light. Committees were formed, hearings were scheduled. For the first time in living memory, the monarchy was placed under the scrutiny of those it had long reigned above. But as the truth unraveled further, the nation itself fractured. The public was divided. Some hailed Anne as a patriot, a fearless crusader who put people above privilege. Others saw betrayal, a woman who had turned against her own blood, her crown, her country. The headlines screamed, the debates grew vicious, and yet Anne remained silent. And behind the palace walls another story unfolded. King Charles, already frail from years of pressure and recent scandal, began to visibly decline. Reports of cancelled engagements became more frequent. His public appearances grew shorter. Rumours swirled. Insiders whispered of a monarch quietly breaking under the weight of a house cracking from within. But no official statement was released. No admission was made. The firm had returned to what it knew best: stoic silence. As the world debated and dissected Anne's crusade, she disappeared from the spotlight. No royal duties, no press sightings, just Balmoral, the place where she had once confronted the truth, and now chose to reflect on it. Alone on the moors, wrapped in the quiet hum of the Highlands, she watched the storm clouds gather on the horizon. Not with fear, but with understanding. The winds had changed. The monarchy would endure as it always had. But it would never be the same again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.